to ElixirZone. I have a super exciting episode to share with you today. I've been thinking about it and researching it for weeks, and it took quite a while for the ideas to gel, but they've gelled, and I think you're going to like it. I'm looking at biology and software, specifically Erlang, and I think there's some really exciting ideas that are going to come out of this comparison. I'm going to start with an analogy, which is from my youth. One of the more memorable ads of my youth was this Reese's Peanut Butter Cup ad where two people were walking toward each other down the street, listening to their music on their Walkmans, which was a thing back in the day. And one of them was eating a chocolate bar, which makes sense. The other one was eating out of a bucket of peanut butter, which makes absolutely no sense, but go with it. So they bump into each other, and they're both mad. One of them says, "You got chocolate in my peanut butter." And the other says, "You got peanut butter in my chocolate." And they both taste it, and they're like, this is delicious. And they discovered that the two things together made each better. So this is the analogy I want to start off with today. So in this analogy, why is my page not working here? Oh, here we go. Okay, so the man on the left is representing biology, and the woman on the right's representing software. And the combination of biology and software has done amazing things for biology. So in biology, they have bioinformatics, which is a whole field. They have computational biology. You basically could not do biology today without computers and software. It's revolutionized biology and enabled all kinds of things. There are whole departments. Cornell has a computational biology department. Harvard Medical School has an informatics department. It's blown up in biology. What about the other side? What does software learn from biology? Well, we do have genetic algorithms, but I can't think of much else. And this could be a limitation in my knowledge of software, but it seems like software hasn't learned too much from biology, at least directly. And we're going to dig into that. I think there is a ton for software to learn from biology, and I'm going to show you a lot of examples and show them in an Erlang context, many of them, but also some things that I think biology does that Erlang does not do, which might provide future directions for Erlang and other languages to consider. Let's start with something called Gall's law. Gall was a pediatrician, but he was fascinated with systems, why they sometimes worked, how they often failed. He studied them extensively, and he came up with this quote, which I really like, which is often used in a software engineering context. "A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be patched up to make it work. You have to start over with a working, simple system." So Gall's law is saying that designing large software systems is hard. We want to architect these big things. Things never go according to plan. You can have what you think is the greatest, most thoughtful design ever, but once you actually start building it, you're going to discover your knowledge was lacking. There were things that you didn't consider that make your original plans not pan out as you had hoped. So let's evolve software. Well, this is called the big ball of mud. I have worked on big balls of mud. I suspect most of the people listening to this episode have also worked on big balls of mud. What's a big ball of mud? A big ball of mud is a haphazardly structured, sprawling, sloppy, duct tape and baling wire spaghetti code jungle. These systems show unmistakable signs of unregulated growth and repeated expedient repair. Information is shared promiscuously among distant elements of the system, often to the point where nearly all the important information becomes global or duplicated. The overall structure of the system may never have been well designed. If it was, it may have eroded beyond recognition. Programmers with a shred of architectural sensibility shun these quagmires. Only those who are unconcerned about architecture and perhaps comfortable with the inertia of the day-to-day chore of patching the holes in these failing dikes are content to work on such systems. So we found that architecting and designing, upfront design of large software systems is hard. Now we're hearing that evolving large software systems is hard. So where does that leave us? In this paper, they said that complexity is the single major difficulty in successful development of large-scale software systems. The software crisis was first identified in 1968, and in the intervening decades has deepened rather than abated. We believe the major contributor to this complexity in many systems is the handling of state and the burden that this adds when trying to analyze and reason about the system. So this is something we covered at length in the prior episode. Joe Armstrong says state explosion is the source of all difficulties in software development. People just can't reason about these gigantic balls of state that we've created. So his solution is to chop it up into little pieces, each with its own state that we can reason about. And that gets us, so to summarize this research, after 50 plus years of trying, we still can't build software systems well because the state space is too large for our brains. So again, this is what Joe Armstrong's saying, and that's why he's saying we have to break it up into small processes that we can reason about. Little tangent here. This man is Richard Feldman. I love this guy. He's given some great talks. I encourage you to listen to them. I used to love Elm. Unfortunately, I never got a chance to use it in my day job, so I've sort of not used it in quite a while. But he was an evangelist for Elm. He gives great talks. He had this talk, which, congratulations, Richard, has just reached over 1 million views, was asking the question, why isn't functional programming the norm? And he gives a lot of interesting answers in there, and I'm not going to go into the rest of them, but one that he mentioned is that basically functional programming may not be the norm today, but it is definitely a major trend. Languages are getting more and more functional programming features added to them, and many books are being written. This is just JavaScript alone has 8 books that he listed. He had several other slides in other languages showing functional programming being added to other languages as well. So this is a major trend. Languages are becoming more functional, but I have a question which is similar but different. Why isn't concurrent programming the norm? I want to propose one idea there based on, we talked earlier about the global interpreter lock that Ruby and Python and other languages have. In this article, they said the developers of Python receive a lot of complaints regarding this, but a language as popular as Python cannot bring a change as significant as the removal of the global interpreter lock without causing backward incompatibility issues. The creator of Python gave an answer to the community in 2007 in his article, "It Isn't Easy to Remove the GIL." So Python community has been working on this for, 14 years now? At least, and they haven't been able to do it yet. So it is hard. Languages want to become more concurrent and parallel, but they can't because it's not like an extra feature that you can just shoehorn into your language. It's a fundamental building block. And so they're sort of stuck. So that's part of my answer. But we know from our earlier episodes that Erlang and Elixir enable tremendous fault tolerance, which is just not achievable in most other languages, in part because of these separate, small, isolated processes that can fail and can be fixed up. The failure can be addressed by other processes that didn't fail. They can detect the problem and address them. Klarna is a company that's worth tens of billions of dollars. They run on Erlang, and this talk here, he talks about why they have basically no downtime. Again, to summarize our previous episodes, here's Joe Armstrong in another of his fabulous talks. He said, building fault-tolerant software boils down to detecting errors and doing something when errors are detected. And I would add to that something he would say, but of course you don't want to do it locally, you want to fix it somewhere else. We can't fix our own errors when we're fatally ill. Somebody else has got to help us. So this is all review at the moment. We're going to go further. Joe called this out-of-bounds error handling. So you don't try to fix your own problem. You don't add all kinds of error handling code to your own module or whatever it might be. You have some other process monitor you and react when you go down. Again, more review. So in Erlang, we have the ability to spawn new processes. Process 1 can spawn process 2. When they spawn, they can link to it, which means that when process 2, the process that it spawned, goes down, it will receive a down message. And if the spawning process is not trapping exits, that will cause it to die as well. If it is trapping exits, it sort of becomes like a monitor. Again, as review, the difference between links and monitors. I like this description from Samuel Mullen. If linking processes like a couple who've grown old together and can't live without the other, monitoring processes is like reading the obituaries. You know who's died and you might feel bad about it, but it doesn't affect you much beyond that. So this is all in the way of review. And then with these primitives, you can build supervision trees. And a supervision tree at the bottom level, you have the worker nodes that do the actual work. And above them, you have supervisors, which can monitor workers or other supervisors. And the supervisors, these double circles is a notation in Erlang to indicate that they're trapping exits. So if the children die, the supervisor, which is linked to the worker, will receive a down notification, but it won't automatically die. It will intelligently determine what it wants to do, restart the worker, or if that has failed too many times, it will perhaps kill itself and then let its supervisor decide what to do at that point. So again, this is just review of what's possible in Erlang today. Now we're going to start moving on to the new stuff. So this is a slide from Alan Kay's 1997 talk, "The Computer Revolution Hasn't Happened Yet." In it, he has this slide where he says we need to move as software engineers from clockwork to biology. And he describes that current software is based on sort of gears, and the gears need to mesh together. They need to fit together. And he says that works at small scales, but at larger scales it breaks down because these gears cannot be built with such incredible tolerance that the gears always mesh together exactly right. As you add more and more gears, eventually things stop working together. They get out of sync, and then that blows up the whole system. I don't know why I didn't do this slide correctly. The method calls are supposed to show up later. But this is what I would call tight coupling, where objects call methods on other objects. And on the right, I call it loose coupling, where it's message passing. The biological entities, whether our cells or bacteria, they do communicate with signals with other bacteria, for example. It's all based on message passing. The messages being chemicals that get passed around inside our body or in the ecosystem where the amoeba is living or whatever it might be. So Alan Kay argued we need to move from tight coupling, sort of engineering our systems, and trying to make it more and more complicated by better and better design, and move toward loose coupling, where objects sort of interact with each other through message passing. He didn't say message passing, but he did say that he thought message passing was the key concept behind objects. And so what I think of the left-hand side, as it grows and grows, eventually it causes failures to cascade because there's no sort of built-in error correction. Whereas on the right, the system can recover from failures because things are resilient. Joe Armstrong complained that programmers obsess over objects when the fascinating stuff happens in the space between the objects. And I think that was, so this is Alan Kay and Joe, I think, were totally in sync on this, that they thought that objects should communicate through messages, and that those messages were really exciting. That was the exciting dimension that they wanted to bring to programming, and felt that it could move software engineering forward. This is a book I just read by Adam Savage, Every Tool's a Hammer. I'm going to read a brief passage from it. So he was talking about creators and creation. He says creation is iteration. So if you try something and it doesn't work, that's not failure. That's just part of the discovery process. You tried something, it didn't work out, you learned, you move on with that new knowledge that you've acquired. So he said then, creation is iteration. The key is tolerance, both literal and figurative. creators need patience and endurance. So you don't just give up the first time something doesn't work. That part's clear. But then the second part of this was really interesting. He said, and mechanical tolerance. That is permissible variation in the manufacture of an object, like the space between a nut and a bolt. Loose tolerance provides durability from parts that can take more abuse because dents, dings, and dirt have room to move without inhibiting the performance of the larger machine. The Kalashnikov's loose tolerance engineering provides high reliability in the field. So tight coupling can provide tremendous precision, but it also makes systems brittle. Whereas loose tolerance may not give you the highest performance, but it makes things a lot more resilient. Here's a great example. I love this example. So this is a baby incubator, but it's not a standard incubator that you'd find in your local hospital. It is a specially designed incubator, and let's explore why. Every year, over 4 million infants in the developing world die within a month of birth. Half of these newborns would survive if given a warm and clean environment in which to grow stronger. In developing countries, not only is there limited access to modern high-tech incubators, but a lack of infrastructure and replacement parts render such devices worthless. So they break, and then they can't fix them. Neo-nurture takes advantage of an abundant local resource in developing countries, car parts. The incubator leverages the existing supply chain of the auto industry and the technical understanding of local car mechanics. The incubator uses sealed beam headlights as a heating element, a dashboard fan for convective heat circulation, signal lights and a door chime serve as alarms, and a motorcycle battery and car cigarette lighter provide backup power during incubator transport and power outages. This is a really clever design for enabling a system to recover from failure. If you build it with parts that aren't available in the places where the system's going to get used, as soon as anything breaks, the whole system becomes useless. So you want to take that into account when you're designing things, because things will break. And this is not a new idea. This is something von Neumann in the 50s, John von Neumann, one of the most famous people in computing, wrote a paper on the synthesis of reliable organisms from unreliable components. And he said that error is viewed, therefore, not as an extraneous and misdirected or misdirecting accident, but as an essential part of the process under consideration. Its importance in the synthesis of automata being fully comparable to that of the factor which is normally considered the intended and correct logical structure. So he's saying we think about the happy path and think that's 99% of the problem, and the error handling is 1% of the problem. But he's saying no, you can't think that way. You need to error handling is just as much a part of the problem as the happy path itself. And otherwise, you're never going to have reliable systems. If pieces can break and you haven't factored in how you're going to recover from those breaks, you're going to have a bad time. Even better than just recovering from failures is growing stronger through failures. This is a very interesting book that I read a couple months ago by Nassim Taleb, and it's called Antifragile: Things That Gain from Disorder. So he's pointing out that just as human bones get stronger when subjected to stress and tension, and rumors or riots intensify when someone tries to repress them, many things in life benefit from stress, disorder, volatility, and turmoil. What Taleb has identified and calls antifragile is that category of things that not only gain from chaos, but need it in order to survive and flourish. So if we can build systems that not only recover from failure, but become stronger through failure, like our muscles do when we exercise. After we exercise, they heal and become stronger. We break them apart a little bit, and then they heal up stronger than ever. That's the ideal. So can we get there? So in our earlier episodes, we talked at length about how the real world is concurrent. Today we're going to talk some about how the amazing world inside of you is concurrent as well. It takes time for signals to travel from your brain to your muscles, etc. Chemicals floating around in your bloodstream takes time to move around your body. Your body is a very, very complex machine, and it is concurrent. Additionally, and sort of the point of this talk today, is that objects in the world are state machines. And all the tiny molecular machines that compose your body are also state machines. Each cell inside your body is a molecular machine. It's actually tremendously complex what's going on inside just a single cell in your body. And of course you have massive numbers of cells which are not identical to each other. They're very differentiated, even though they all originate from the same exact DNA. So they have it's effectively like having a whole bunch of different programs running that are all based on the same program. I mean, it's hard to even say that sentence in a meaningful way. Usually when we think of a program, that defines the behavior of something. But every cell in your body has exactly the same program in terms of DNA. It's the exact same DNA in every cell. The difference is how the DNA is interpreted into proteins. And that is basically because each cell is its own state machine, and each cell has its own state, and that state evolves over time. And that's sort of the main idea we're going to dig into today. Here's a very simple example of what a state machine is and why it's relevant. So this is something, I don't know if you can see it here, but I had to buy this pen, what do you call it, a pen holder, because I ruined several pairs of white shorts because I would stick my ballpoint pen in my pocket, and the ink, I would put it in, the pen would be closed, but I would put it in my pocket, and then I'd take it out a day later, and the pen would be open, and there'd be ink all over my pocket. And sometimes it would even leak through to the shorts. So I had to throw out a couple pairs of pants, shorts, white shorts, and then I ended up buying some of these, and that solved the problem. When I took this out earlier today to look at it, half the pens were in the open position. Even though I put them all in the closed position, they opened up while they were in there. Sort of half of them randomly get bumped and they end up in the open position. You can see, I don't know if you can see it, but there's a lot of blue ink at the bottom here, which luckily has not ended up in my pants. I don't like having to use this, but the state of the pen in my pocket changes. And when it's not in my pocket, I don't care about whether it's open or closed. But when I put it in a closed state in my pocket, it's dangerous because it can change state. And when that happens, I get angry, and it costs me money. So I ended up buying these pocket protectors. I think my pocket protectors make me an official geek. I've been a geek my whole life, but now it's absolutely 100% official. This is my thesis for today's talk. My thesis is, well, we're going to talk about what selective receive is very soon. We know message passing. My thesis is that what Erlang is doing and what biology has been doing for billions of years is selective receive message passing among state machines. I think this has evolved in biology, and I believe this is how biology solves complexity, and I believe it's how software systems can solve complexity as well. Biology and software are different, but the challenges that they face to scale up are very, very similar. And that's why I think that we've basically got convergent evolution here. I think the solution that biology has found over billions of years is very similar to the solution that Ericsson, Joe Armstrong, and his colleagues at Ericsson came up with to solve the telecom problems that they faced. Maybe the optimal, I don't know if it's the optimal solution, but it's a very good solution to a shared problem. So this is sort of my thesis for today, and we're going to go into a lot of detail on it. So one more slide from Alan Kay in '97. He said, up until now we've been constructing software. Moving forward, he hoped we'd be growing software. Erlang has a history here. Unlike most languages, there's been a surprising amount of innovation in neurobiology. There's the NX project in Elixir now for machine learning. I'll show you in a minute another thing. But there's also this book, which I've never looked at, but this is a gigantic book, 850 pages long, on neuroevolution through Erlang. Erlang is well suited to studying evolutionary processes. As the author of that book pointed out in a presentation, he said he wanted to elaborate on why Erlang is such a great fit for the field of computational intelligence and its future. There's also in the Elixir community, there's been a recently published book called Genetic Algorithms in Elixir. I have it. I have only gotten about 15 pages in. I look forward to hopefully someday getting to the end. But it exists. It's something you can check out, and it sounds exciting. It also is pretty cool that the book has its own official spokesdog. I've never heard of a book having its own spokesdog before. I think that's pretty cool. So what is it about biological systems and the parallels to the way Erlang does things? I'm going to list a bunch of features that I see as major features of biological systems. Many have parallels in Erlang, some of them with some other, sort of more recent innovations in programming. So let's go through the list. So they're asynchronous and distributed. They're modular and composable, so like you have all these little cells that interact. Of course, within a cell, there's organelles within the cell, intracellular objects that interact with each other. Then, of course, cells compose up into organs, and organs compose up into organisms, and organisms compose up into superorganisms, like an ant colony. It's hard to imagine an ant living an isolated life unto itself. It really belongs as part of a colony, just like bees do. And human society wouldn't exist without the human superorganism. Biological systems kill malfunctioning cells, and we'll go into detail on that. Infected cells, cancerous cells, cells that get insufficient energy, the food supply, it will kill itself because it's afraid that it will malfunction if it doesn't get enough food, or if it gets excessive heat or cold, cells will kill themselves. Biological systems tend to self-heal themselves. They communicate via signaling and messaging. They respond to stimuli, they auto-scale. So like if I eat too much food, my body will create new fat cells. If I fast, as I have over the last 5 years or so, and I guess I've lost weight over the last 5 years, and my body has probably scaled down the number of fat cells that it has, which is cool. Biological systems learn from experience and data. I've learned just putting this presentation together. And of course, machine learning and AI are very hot right now, and they use similar techniques, which is something we'll talk about in my next presentation. I'm not going there today. And biological systems grow and evolve. And lastly, they don't require reboots. Often when we redeploy software, we tear something down and restart it, like a Kubernetes system. Usually, kill off the container and start a new container with a different image. Biological systems don't do that for the most part. I mean, you could say that like each generation is sort of a reboot, but the lifetime of an individual can be years and years, decades long, without any reboots. Sorry, I went the wrong way. I saw this tweet the other day. I can't shut down my car because it's updating its firmware. We have this limitation in modern technology. There are three main categories of signals that biological systems use. One is autocrine systems, which is when a cell emits a message which binds to its own receptors. So it's basically signaling itself. Paracrine signals are signals that the cell releases which communicate to nearby cells. And the third category is endocrine signals, which are basically put into the bloodstream and float around the body until they connect with the specific target cell that has a receptor on its membrane which it binds to. So that's for sending long distance signals. So let's get into some code examples here. I'm going to start with why we're able in Erlang to send a message to ourselves. So let's look at why we might want to do that. Okay, so let's simulate an autocrine signal, which is sending a message to yourself. That's what a cell does, sends a chemical that binds to its own membrane. In Erlang, we can do that. I'm going to give you a tiny little example, mytimer.erl. By the way, all the code that I'm writing from now on, I will add to a Git repo that I link to in ElixirZone on YouTube. I've added the first 2 episodes code files there. You can look at those, and I will upload the current episodes code soon after posting this video. So let's look at the, where'd it go? Trying to get to the code. There it is. There we go. Okay, so you'll see when you go into the Git repo, you'll see there's an Erlang 103 directory with all the code for this episode in there. So let's look at let's look at my timer first. So it's very simple. There's a start function which spawns a new process, which just does two things. There's an anonymous function that first it displays that it started, then it loops. It calls the loop function. The loop function displays the current time, and then it schedules a message called next tick to go to itself in 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds. Next tick is just a bare Elixir, Erlang atom, and then inside loop it goes into a receive loop. The loop is listening for a specific message, next tick, which it will receive in exactly 1 second. When it receives that, it will recursively call itself again. So it will again display the time. It will send itself. It will schedule a message to get sent to itself, a next tick message to get sent 1 second later, and then it will start listening, and a second later it will receive that message and call itself again. So that's all it is. There's a stop function, but that's basically all that's going on here. But this is how you can send a signal to yourself. So let's run it. My timer start. Erlang time is a little weird. To keep this simple and save myself time, I didn't make it any fancier, but you can see this is incrementing every second. This is hour, minute, second. You can also get the date in a similar format. So that's all there is to that. So let's go back to here. So that's an Autocrine-like signal or message. Let's look at Paracrine signals next. A Paracrine signal is a message that you send out to nearby cells to communicate with your neighbors effectively. Here's an example. It says when a cell is damaged, it releases a number of factors that result in a number of things. That is, the damaged cells tell other cells that they've been damaged and need repair. One of these factors is a factor that causes endothelial cells, the cells that line the blood vessels, to move toward the site of the wound so that new capillaries can form. New skin cells are also stimulated to move to the site of the wound. They're attracted by yet another factor. Many immune cells, especially macrophages, are also attracted to the site of the injury. So paracrine signals are used in immune responses and healing damage. So it's like a way to make a call for help. We're not going to do it as a call for help. I'm just going to give the simplest possible example of what a paracrine signal might look like in Erlang. The example here is I called pingpong.erl. So let's look at pingpong.erl. There we go. So bi pingpong.erl. So what we're going to do here, we're going to call start function. Start is going to spawn two separate processes. The first process, so this is module, when you say spawn, this is module function arguments. So this is going to call the ping-pong module, which is the same module we're already in, the ping method, or function rather, and pass no arguments. And the spawn function will return the PID for the process that it spawned. We'll assign that to the ping PID variable. Then we will, it's interesting, actually, by the way, in Erlang, variables are not variable. You can only assign a value once to a variable. So even though it's called a variable, it's only variable when you do an initial assignment. You can't update a variable within the same context. You could have a variable with the same name in a different context, but it wouldn't be the same variable. It would just happen to have the same name. But yeah, within the scope, when I say context, I really mean scope in programming terms. So it's going to spawn a second process called pingpong. The module is pingpong, the function is pong, and no arguments. So one process is going to run this function, which is going to just listen for a message, either a tuple of a PID and a message pong, in which case it will say that it received a pong, and it will then send to the PID that it received the pong from. It will send a message with its own PID and the message ping. And then it will then also recursively call itself to listen for the next message. Pong, similarly, it is very similar. The difference here is that ping and pong are reversed. So basically it's listening for a ping message, and then it sends a pong message in response, and again calls itself recursively. The one other thing that's happening here is once we set up these two processes to listen for messages, we're going to kick off. We could have one of these processes do it itself, but I'm doing it in the start function. I'm sending a single message to the pong PID with the message pong. Sorry, I'm basically simulating the pong process sending its own PID and the pong message to the ping process. So this is the ping PID. So this is going to kick off the messaging. So we're just going to run this. We're going to load and compile this program, which we do with our C for compile, ping pong, and then we're just going to start it. And you'll see here that it's created an infinite loop, which I will talk about in a moment. But interestingly, in Erlang, if you do Control G at this point, you can escape from this. So this is a user, we can hit H for help, and it shows us the various things that we can do. So we can kill the job, we can list all jobs, right? And there's only one job. I started up a console shell, and then I started processes from that shell. But I can create a new shell. If I hit S, now if I say J, we'll see that there are two shells going. There's the initial shell that I was in, and now I'm in a different shell. So I can now go and kill that first shell if I want, K1. And if I say J again, there's only one shell, but it's a different shell. It's not the shell that I started in, it's a new shell. And now I can go into this cell. Let's connect to number 2, and now I'm in a shell which is reporting that there was an error in the other shell, but of course I haven't crashed because I'm in a new shell now. So that's how Control G will let you access that if you ever get stuck in an infinite loop, as we just did. Right now I'm just going to get out of this and go back to this. So that's like Paracrine messages, signals, which we're sending. The ping and the pong cells or processes were communicating with each other by sending each other messages. What we effectively simulated is something called a cytokine storm. This is a real thing in biology. A cytokine storm is a physiological reaction in humans and other animals in which the innate immune system causes an uncontrolled and excessive release of pro-inflammatory signaling molecules called cytokines. Normally, cytokines are part of the body's immune response to infection, but their sudden release in large quantities can cause multi-system organ failure and death. In programming, similarly, you can set off an infinite loop or some sort of recursive thing that can lock up your system. Fortunately, because Erlang has the ability to interrupt running processes, even if it gets stuck in an infinite loop, it will get interrupted, and you can then independently get another shell, or some other process can detect the infinite loop and kill it, and your program can continue on safely. So we just effectively simulated a cytokine storm there. This is a depiction of the interior of a single cell in your body. There's lots of different pieces. Obviously, if we focused in more, we'd see more and more stuff. There could be many. Each of these things is stylized. There could be many different. It could be hundreds of each of these items that we're seeing here. This is just a stylized drawing. So the point is that each cell is unto itself a constantly changing ecosystem composed of various organelles, proteins, etc. So there's the nucleus in the center where the DNA lives, and then the DNA is used to create all kinds of RNA and other proteins, which basically drive everything that the cell does. It's very complicated. This book here, which I hope to get my hands on at some point, but it looks interesting. It's saying a computer in every living cell. A distinguished cell biologist explains how living cells perform computations. How does a single-cell creature, such as an amoeba, live such a sophisticated life? How does it hunt living prey, respond to lights, sounds, and smells, and display complex sequences of movements without the benefit of a nervous system? The internal chemistry of living cells is a form of computation. Cells are built out of molecular circuits that perform logical operations, as electronic devices do. So we're going to see a short video now of some of the things that go on inside of each of our cells. This is not actually a video, but a simulation of what scientists say is actually happening inside of our cells. Let's look at this short clip of a strand of DNA being unzipped and copied within your cell. This happens whenever a cell divides. It needs to clone its DNA and give a full set to each of the child cells that get created when the cell splits.
Unwind the two strands, you can see that each has a sugar phosphate backbone connected to the sequence of nucleic acid base pairs, known by the letters A, T, G, and C. Now the strands run in opposite directions, which is important when you go to copy DNA. Copying DNA is one of the first steps in cell division. Here, the two strands of DNA are being unwound and separated by the tiny blue molecular machine called helicase. Helicase literally spins as fast as a jet engine. The strand of DNA on the right has its complementary strand assembled continuously, but the other strand is more complicated because it runs in the opposite direction, so it must be looped out with its complementary strand assembled in reverse, section by section. At the end of this process, you have two identical DNA molecules, each one a few centimeters long, but just a couple nanometers wide. So to prevent the DNA from becoming a tangled mess, it is wrapped around proteins called histones, forming a nucleosome. These nucleosomes are bundled together into a fiber known as chromatin, which is further looped and coiled to form a chromosome, one of the largest molecular structures in your body.
Amazing. So I encourage you to watch videos. If you look for molecular machine cell biology, you'll find some incredible videos. So even though all cells in an organism have identical DNA, the behavior of each cell can be completely different. We have brain cells, hair follicles, we have skin cells, we have heart cells, and within each of those organs, the cells can behave very differently as well. And it's all based on gene expression. Genes can get enabled or turned on and off within a cell dynamically over time. And like if you're a skin cell, there are a lot of specific sections of your DNA that you will want to use, and other sections that you will never want to use. But it's all there within each of your cells, and everything gets turned on and off through a very complex system of chemical reactions that go on inside your cell, each of your cells. All cells, when you're you're just a single cellular combination of egg and sperm, you're a single cell, and all the cells of your current body derive from that single cell that once existed inside your mother. And as the cells divided and proliferated, they started to specialize. And the specialization process, there's several pathways by which the specialization occurs, but one of the main pathways is basically listening to your neighbors. It's sort of a peer pressure situation where if your nearby cells have chosen to become skin cells, you're likely to turn into a skin cell of yourself. There are other mechanisms involved as well. I'm not going to get into it, but it is, again, messaging based. Here's a description of how the undifferentiated cell at the top differentiates into muscle cell or a brain cell or some other type of cell. Again, you have that single DNA in every cell, You express or don't express certain segments of that DNA, and then whatever sections of DNA you do express, those turn into proteins, which change the state of the cell and enable it to specialize to a specific function. The analogy that was made in this video was to a library. Both of these people have access to the exact same set of books, but they look at different books, and if you read, whatever books you read will shape what's inside your brain and how you think and act and behave, and maybe even what you feel. So if even though these two people have access to the identical set of books, they are reading from separate books, and that affects who they become. Another way in which cells change over time and are really state machines is that cells can engulf stuff from outside of their membranes, and they can spit things out that they don't want, spit them out into the bloodstream or whatever might be outside of their cells. So cells are constantly evolving and changing. They're very complex state machines. So let's go to another code example, my toggled timer. So this is a richer example of the timer that we looked at a moment ago. This timer, my toggled timer. Oh, I forgot to say URL. Let's try adding the URL there. So this, so here we have a loop. Let's start down here. So what is start going to do? Start is going to look up an initial state. The initial state here, this is Erlang's terminology for a map. A map is a set of key value pairs. In this case, there's a key display, which is an atom, and another key next tick ref. The initial value of display is true, and the initial value of next tick ref is nil. So that's what we're going to assign to the variable state here. Then we will spawn a new process, which will run this anonymous function. It will display timer has started, and then it will loop with this initial state. And spawn will return the PID, and we will register the name, the PID to the name my timer, so we'll be able to interact with it. So inside the loop, it's going to take that initial state that we just looked at, that map, and it will, depending on what the state says, it may schedule the next tick. So maybe schedule next tick here has two function clauses. The first function clause, this is called pattern matching. The first function clause, you'll see that there's one here for any state, and there's one here for a specific state. So what will happen is when maybe schedule next tick gets called with a single argument, the single argument gets assigned to the value within this function of state, and then it attempts to pattern match it to this, which may or may not succeed. So if there is a key of next tick ref, and if the value of that key is nil, then this is the function that will get called, or the function clause that will get called. If this does not match the pattern, so if there's a state variable but it does not have a next tick ref, or it has a next tick ref but the value is not nil, then it will go down here. So what we're saying is, we're saying maybe schedule a next tick. If there is not yet a reference to a next tick, we will schedule a next tick. So next tick is Erlang send after, which we saw in the earlier one. So after 1 second, send ourself the message next tick. And when you say send after, the return value is a reference to that scheduled event. So we store that in next tick ref. We then this is how you update a map. So the state that we passed in we called it state here. And what we're going to do, the map is state. If you're used to Elixir, usually state would come at the beginning, not at the end. Erlang does it this way typically. So maps update is the maps module, the update function within the maps module. We're calling it with 3 arguments. The first is next tick ref. So that's what we're saying. The key, we want to update the key next tick ref. The value we want to update it to is the value of next tick ref, which we just is the reference to the next tick. event, and the map that we're updating is called state. It's what we passed in initially, and we return the updated map. On the other hand, if the state that we pass into maybe schedule next tick does not match this pattern, so if either there is no next tick ref or there is a next tick ref but it's not nil but has a value of a non-nil value, we will return the state unchanged. So when this function gets called, at the end of it there will be a reference to next tick, because I guarantee there's always going to be a next tick ref, because in the initial state we set up a next tick ref. So there will always be a next tick ref key inside this map. Whether it's nil or not, we don't know until we call this function and then we look. But either it will be nil or it will be non-nil. If it's non-nil, we're going to return the map unchanged. If it is nil, we're going to create a next tick and take the reference and put it into the map. So that's maybe schedule next tick. We then call maybe display time. Maybe display time is also using pattern matching. It passes in that same map, the Erlang map here, but this time we're trying to pattern match on the display key. So the display key is going to be a Boolean. The value is a Boolean. It's going to be true or false. If it's true, we will display the time. If it is not true, if it's false, we're just going to return the atom OK, which basically becomes a no-op, because we're not doing anything with the response that we receive here. So we're ignoring the response. So once we've maybe scheduled the next tick, and once we have maybe displayed the time, we go into the receive loop. And what's going to happen is a second later we will receive a new tick message. And once we do, we will then call maps update again. We will set the next tick ref to nil to indicate, because we've now received the next tick, so we want to unset that value, and then loop again. And at that point, when we hit maybe schedule next tick, it will find out that there is a nil value associated with next tick ref, and it will set up a new tick ref and assign it to the map. But the user can also call toggle display. So if the user calls toggle, this is a user function here. If the user calls toggle, it will send the toggle display atom as a message to my timer. And then this message, the receive block will receive that message and do something different. So first it will get the value of display inside the state that we're passing in around, and that will be the current display value. We will then we will flip it. So if current display is true, not current display will be false. Or if current display is false, then not current display will be true. And so here we're updating. What are we updating? We're updating the state. We're updating the display key inside the state. And we're basically flipping the current display from true to false or false to true. And then we're looping again. So if I say toggle display, that will flip the value of the display key to be either true or false. So again, that's triggered through the user function toggle. So we have the user here can call start or toggle. So let's see what happens. So we're going to call, this is my toggled timer. So Erlang, compile my toggled timer. And we still call it, so now we're going to say my toggled timer start. That's not right, typo. There you go. Now the timer is working. Now I want to say my toggled timer, what's it called? Toggle. So we're going to toggle the value of display. So we toggled display, and now the messages are still getting sent every second. The timer is still calling itself, but it's no longer displaying the message. But if I retoggle, it's going to change. So we toggled the display from true to false. Now we're going to toggle this display value from false to true, and it should start displaying again. So you can see it jumped from 15 seconds to 39 seconds. That's presumably how long I've been talking since I did the first toggle. So the underlying process continued ticking away every second, but we had basically said, okay, we no longer want to see the messages, don't display them. If we hit toggle again, it'll continue looping, but it will and ticking, but it will no longer display. And if I say toggle again, it will start displaying again. So this is a state machine, and you can change the behavior by sending messages to the process. Let's go back. Okay, so slideshow from current slide. Sorry, back to this. Apoptosis is literally programmed cell death. I mean, you see the word program right there in the definition. It is programming, and Erlang also has its own way to kill a cell or a process, which we'll get to in a minute. What happens in apoptosis is basically you send a signal or signals to a cell which trigger the cell to kill itself. And each cell has basically programming built into it, a kill switch inside it. And when the kill switch gets triggered, the cell starts destroying itself. And when it destroys itself, instead of just opening its membrane and leaking all the contents into the surrounding environment, which could be dangerous, like if there could, for example, be lots of viruses inside the cell, and that's why the cells decide to kill itself. There needs to be a cleanup process so we don't just spew all that junk into the surrounding cells. So there's a mechanism for destroying everything inside the cell, recycling all the contents of the cell, and there are special cells that focus on doing that cleanup. But the cell itself kills itself, and it's done in a clean way. It's called apoptosis. It's not a rare thing. It happens inside. It's probably happening at this very second inside of you. The average human loses 50 to 70 billion cells a day due to apoptosis. It's a very important thing because your body needs to regenerate itself. Almost every part of you regenerates. There's a few things like the cells on your lens and probably a lot of your neurons that do not regenerate themselves, but most of you changes. I think I once heard that every 7 years you're a totally different person. I don't think that's quite true, but to a first approximation it is. We are constantly, replacement of our cells also occurs in most of the other tissues in our body, not the lenses of our eyes and most neurons. Those are counterexamples. So what triggers apoptosis? There's two major mechanisms. Here I'm going to talk about the first. So this is the cell membrane here, and a message called a ligand, that red dot there at the top is a ligand. It binds to a special receptor, and that when that specific ligand binds to that specific receptor, that sends a message to the nucleus saying, kill yourself. And it may be that there's a sort of a voting mechanism, and a single message may not trigger the cell to die. It may need more than a single message. So this is oversimplification, I think, but it's basically true that basically there's a way to signal through the cell membrane that the cell should kill itself. It's called the death-inducing signaling complex, or DISC. And when this happens, it's basically the same thing as we are able to do in Erlang when we send the kill signal to a cell or a process using the exit function. This was pointed out by Garrett Smith. I keep bumping into his talks, which are wonderful. He actually, I went searching for talks on software and biology, and this was the first thing that showed up. I'm curious whether this is because Google knows that I am interested in Erlang, or whether this is because this topic is most likely to arise in an Erlang context, because most software is not very biological in nature. I'm not sure the answer, but I'm curious. But Garrett Smith has pointed out this exact phenomenon, this similarity between software and biology, especially in the Erlang context, and he even talked about programmed cell death. So you might want to take a look at that talk. Why would a cell kill itself? Many reasons. Stress can bring the cell to suicide. Various reasons: heat, excessive cold, radiation, nutrient deprivation, viral infections, a lack of oxygen, increased intracellular concentration of free fatty acids, too much calcium inside the cell, etc., etc. Many reasons. The cell detects that it's unhealthy and decides to kill itself. There's a second pathway. So the external signals that come from outside the cell is one pathway. A second pathway is from the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are the power cells of our cells. So these, apparently billions of years ago, bacteria merged with cells and they became a powerful duo. And these mitochondria are inherited, although your DNA comes from both your parents equally, that's not true of mitochondrial DNA. You inherit your mitochondria from your mother, so you share your mitochondria and your mitochondrial DNA with your mother. And the mitochondria are sort of, it's another organelle within the cell, but it has the special superpower that it also can trigger apoptosis. So if the mitochondria detect that there is a serious problem, either with the mitochondria or with the surrounding cell environment, it can also call for the cell's death. So that's called the mitochondrial pathway. And the extrinsic pathway is the pathway from outside, starting outside the cell. And interestingly, they can cross-talk with each other. So there is sort of like a voting mechanism or something that maybe the external is saying you should. If maybe both are weak signals, then the combination may be enough to trigger cell death. I'm not sure, but it's vitally important. One example is that we're all born sort of with webbed fingers and toes, and apoptosis is triggered to basically kill off the cells that would otherwise form a web between our fingers and toes. If you didn't have apoptosis, or if you restricted it heavily, you could easily give yourself cancer. It is a powerful mechanism by which your body fights cancer. You can see there's a high relationship between things that suppress apoptosis and things that cause cancer. This is a diagram of how an external cytotoxic T cell can trigger cell death. It can basically attach to your cell. If it's infected, for example, in this picture, it then punches a hole inside the cell wall and puts an enzyme in there that causes the cell to kill itself. And the cell then will hopefully not explode in an uncontrolled way, but in a clean itself up cleanly. But I had to put this in. It's just too fun. Interestingly, they just learned that there's not one type of killer T cell. There's actually two types of T cells, and they used to think they were identical, but the ones that float around in your bloodstream are able to directly kill cells, whereas the ones that don't float around in your bloodstream, instead they release cytokines, which then basically cause other things to come along and kill the cell. And I suspect it's because when it needs to kill a cell in the bloodstream, it's a risk that it could spread throughout your body, and so it wants to kill it right away. And also, because it's in your bloodstream, if it kills the cell and it breaks apart in an unclean way, your bloodstream will probably clean the other white blood cells, etc., in your blood will clean up the mess. But if you directly kill the cell outside the bloodstream, it could be more dangerous because the viruses inside could easily spread to the other cells or something. I'm just completely speculating here, but it's interesting that there's two types of T cells, one of which can directly kill cells and one of which can't. So it's sort of an example of inheritance, another programming similarity. So there's another thing called axon pruning. Axon's part of your neurons, and your body is constantly killing off axons, and it's similar but different from apoptosis. Okay, so let's get into selective receive here in greater detail. I'm going to work through this example twice, once for the normal function call and then once for important. So what we're doing down here, so this is sending 4 messages to self. So self here is, we're just collecting these 4, we're going to send 4 messages to ourself. Each message is a tuple, with the first value being a number and the second value being an atom, either high or low. So the first message is 15 high, second message is 7 low, third message is 1 low, and then the fourth message is 17 high. And these just go in your mailbox. So they've stacked up in your mailbox. And then down here, we call, in the example, it calls multiproc important. But right now, we're gonna call multiproc normal because it's a simpler case. Then we'll go back and see what important does. So in normal listens. It looks in its mailbox for a message, which is a tuple. It's looking for a message with a tuple of any first value. The underscore means I don't care what it is. Just there has to be something there. I don't care what it is. I'm not going to do anything with it. And a capitalized letter means a variable. So this can be anything as well, but we don't just use an underscore because we're actually going to use this value. So we're going to put it down here. So this is basically saying look for any two element tuple. Ignore the first element, take the second element and assign it to the variable message. Then it's going to create, this is a list. And this is the cons operator, which I will work through momentarily. But it's saying, okay, create a list with a first element of whatever value was in message, and then join that to whatever the normal call. We're going to call normal recursively. So we're going to then go. So we get the first message out of the mailbox. Since we're matching any tuple, we're going to grab this message first. So the message here is going to be high. We're going to grab this first message and we're going to store high here. Then we're going to call normal again and grab the second message. Let me start going through this here. So multiproc normal. So we grab the first message, which is high. Then we recurse. We call normal again. When normal is called again, there are 3 messages left in the mailbox. It's going to look for the first one that has a 2-element, that is a 2-element tuple. In this case, it's 7 low. So we're going to grab the value of low and stick it in. That's what we're doing here. Then we're going to cons that with the result of calling normal again. So we're going to recurse another time. So the third time we recurse through, there's going to be 2 messages left in the mailbox, 1 low and 17 high. And so normal is going to pull out that first message, which is low. Where'd it go? The third message is 1 low. It's going to grab the message low and store that as this value here. And then it's going to call normal again. And there's only 1 message left in the mailbox, which is 17 high. So we're going to grab that. 17 high. So that's here. So we get 17 high. We store high. And then we need to recurse again. So even though there are no more messages in the mailbox, we're still recursing because that's what the function is called to do. So normal is going to call itself one more time. This time there will be no messages in the mailbox. So we're going to go down this path. After 0, normally you'd say after 1,000, to say after 1,000 milliseconds. In this case, we're going to say after 0, meaning if there are no more messages inside the mailbox. If there are messages, we'll always go into this receive loop. But if there are none, we will immediately go down this path. And so the value of this last function call is just the empty list. So let's put the empty list in there. So now we've built up this data structure. We have 4 or 5 frames in our data. Because this is not tail recursive, we built up a set of stack frames here. And now we need to unwind these stack frames. And so we're going to do that next. So the first thing to know is that anything consed with the empty list is just a list with that thing in it. So again, now we're going to cons the value low with a list with the value high in it, and that's what the result is. And you do it again, and you do it again, and so here we get our final result, which is a list with 4 elements in it: high, low, low, high. So that was what we get if we call normal. But we're going to do selective receive here. We're going to call important. And important, you'll see it does call normal if it runs out of high priority messages. But as long as there are any high priority messages in there, meaning priority greater than 10, it will prioritize those first and grab them first. And then only when it can't find any more high priority messages will it then call normal. So let's work through that logic. That was supposed to work. Here we go. Hello? Oh, why is this not moving? Okay, here we go. So we're going to call important. So the first thing that happens, again, there's 4 messages in the mailbox now. We've sent the messages again. The first message is 15 high, and that is a priority of greater than 10. So this is the first message. It will match priority message where priority is greater than 10. Priority is 15, so it's greater than 10. So this matches. So we're going to grab the message high and stick it in here, and then call important again. When we call important again, there's going to be 3 messages in the mailbox. We're looking for a message with priority greater than 10, which means we skip this message because that's just priority 7. We're going to skip this message because it's priority 1. Then we're going to grab this message because it's priority 17. So when we grab this message, the message is high, so we're going to store high, and then we're going to call important again. So there are 2 messages left in the mailbox. We're calling important, and we've built up this data structure. We're calling important again. We look for another high priority message. There are none. There are only 2 messages left, and they're both low priority. So at that point, we go into the after block because this is after 0. We're not going to wait. We have no high priority messages to receive, so we're going to call normal. Normal then just goes and grabs any 2 element tuples and stores the message. So we're going to grab this low first, and then we're going to grab this low. Oh, sorry, I forgot to go through. So we're calling normal. So we're going to grab this 7 low, and that becomes this. Then we're going to call normal again. We're recursing again. We're going to grab this last message, this low, and then we're recursing again with normal. When you recurse again with normal and there are no messages in the mailbox, we go into this branch and we get the empty list. And when you do your consing, you end up with high, high, low, low. So same set of 4 messages, but they're processed differently. So this is called selective receive because we're choosing here to ignore certain messages because they don't match what we're looking for. And this is essential. This is hugely, hugely powerful. I'm going to give I'm going to show you an example of code that I evolved from this simple example that you can find. GenStatum is a OTP library that you can use to generate. Gen means gen server or generic server, and Statum is state machine. So this is a library in OTP that allows you to build state machines without building the generic pieces of it that everyone who wants to build a state machine would have to recreate from scratch each time they wanted to use it. The OTP and Erlang maintainers have built a sort of generic state machine that you can then put your specific logic into without having to build everything from scratch. And that also spares us from having 15,000 different implementations of the same generic logic. So I'm going to go through a more elaborate example, but the basic idea here is that you start this thing and then you do things to it and its state changes. Initially, it's counting the number of times it's been pushed. It starts off with 0, then it goes to 1. You can stop it, and then if you try to push again and it's stopped, well, it's in the wrong state. It's no longer receiving push messages, so it's stateful. It's a state machine. I will show you this example, but it's easier to show it to you in the code. You can look at the code yourself in the GitHub repo that I'll point you to. But this is sort of an example. This is a run that I did. So I load up the sleeper module. I call start on it, and that starts a process. I then say hi to the sleeper, but it starts off in the sleeping state. So it doesn't actually respond to me. It just says, I'm asleep. You then call alarm, and that changes the state to awake, and then it responds with the message, I'm up. If you then say hi, so it's the same exact message we sent earlier, but now the state of the object or the process has changed. Oops, didn't want to hit that. And so now when you say hi, it actually answers back to you. And then if you tell it it's bedtime, it says, I'm going to bed, Mom. And then, of course, if you say hi to it again, it doesn't respond. Oops, sorry. If you say bedtime to it, well, it's already sleeping, so that doesn't do anything. But it's sleeping and you hit alarm, I'm up. If you say hi to it, it's awake, so it says hi there. If you say alarm again, it doesn't have any effect because it's already awake. So it's a stateful, when you interact with it, the responses you get are relative to the state that it's in. It doesn't always give you the same answer to something. When you say hi, it can give you different responses depending on its internal state. When you call alarm on it, the response varies depending on its internal state. I missed a thing here, but when you call bedtime, the response is going to vary. And this happens in biology all the time. That's what these cells do. So this is something called a ligand-gated ion channel. So a channel is one of the mechanisms by which things can get in and out of your cells. Ligand is this object here, which is binding to this molecule. It's a gate because it keeps things in, it allows or disallows things to go in and out. It's an ion channel. It's the specific type of gate it is. There's various types of gates that your cell membranes have. So when this ligand is present, this channel opens and certain things can pass through it. Whereas if this ligand were not present, this gate would be closed and things would not be able to go in and out. In a talk that I mentioned last week, there's another quote from Mike Williams that I wanted to mention here because I think he said that this selective reception is critical. So Mike said, earlier, one of the reasons that Erlang was successful, he said earlier systems, there was Plex and other languages at Ericsson, which were good, but they weren't good enough. And that's why they spent years developing Erlang. He said earlier systems had concurrency, but not selective message reception. So at any time, you had to be prepared to receive any message. Think of the matrix of the many states a process can be in and the messages that can come in. So this is like, remember earlier when we had the 2x2 matrix? But if you have a complex process, there can be many, many states and many, many messages. And if you have to have an answer for every single one of them, it's explosive. The complexity explodes. So Mike is saying if you have selective reception, you can reduce that matrix because at every state you can say, I will only receive messages relevant to me now. This, with pattern matching, is one of the fundamental things that makes systems much easier to design because you don't at every state have to receive every message. And this is something that I think is a critical element of Erlang that I did not bring up in earlier talks, but it's very, very much true of biology as well. And that's why I think Erlang has been successful and biological systems have been very successful, is they both have selective reception and they both have stateful processes that evolve, or state machines. Cells are state machines, as are Erlang processes. Here's another example. This is there's various types of gates. This is something similar to a gate called a pump. The difference is, so this pump can be bidirectional. It can pump, I forget if it's potassium and sodium. One of them gets pumped out of the cell because it tends to have a higher concentration outside of the cell. One of them gets pumped into the cell because it has a higher concentration inside the cell. So if you want to work against diffusion, you need a pump where you basically force things to go in a direction other than what it naturally would go, the direction it would normally go through diffusion alone. But this pump can be turned on or off, and it's bidirectional. If you turn it on this way, it's pumping, let's say, the sodium ions out, whereas if you turn it on the other way, it's pumping the potassium ions in. I don't remember the details of this, so don't quote me on that, but that's the idea. It's bidirectional. At any given time, it can be pumping in one direction or the other. Various ways for signals to get in, but it is selective reception, and it's stateful. It's turned on and off over time. Another example of cells communicating, this is inside your brain. This is the synapse between two neurons. These synapses are incredibly small. So a sheet of paper is about 100,000 nanometers wide. The synapse between your brain cells is 20 to 40 nanometers wide. So you can fit over 3,000 synapses in the width of a paper, width of a sheet of paper, which is amazing. So this is another way that cells can communicate through chemicals. I want to jump back from the really small to the really large scale signals. So these are Endocrine system signals, where signals can get spit out from, for example, the pituitary gland inside your brain. And it's these hormones go through your bloodstream, and then they attach to cell walls far, far away from where they were released. So, if you have a kid, as I do, a teenager, there's probably a lot of growth hormone getting pumped out of their brain, going through their body, causing them to grow their muscles and bones and get taller. Every day they seem to be taller. It's frightening. Now they're taller than you. This particular pituitary gland is spitting out human growth hormone. Human growth hormone has systemic effects in various parts of your body. One is your fat cells. Another is your liver. Third is any cells in your body that use glucose, which is pretty much all your body cells. So these are direct effects of human growth hormone. There are also indirect effects. I won't get into all the details, but I want to focus on these because they're very interesting and relevant to health. When you have growth hormone going through your body, your cells want to speed up and do more. They also are less likely to die. So this is sort of like slowing down apoptosis and other cell cleanup mechanisms like what's it called? I forget it. We'll get to it soon. And then it speeds up the rate of cell division and differentiation. So in order to grow, you want your cells dividing and then growing and doing things. But there's a trade-off here, because if you're growing all the time and you're never killing off cells, you're more likely to develop cancer, for example. So there's trade-offs in these things, and so growth hormone has been linked to cancer. There's something else called autophagy, where instead of killing off the entire cell, your cell recycles stuff inside of it. So it gets rid of the junk, it cleans up the junk. So it's just as important for our cells to clean themselves out and clear away debris as taking out the trashes at home. It's a process most of us don't think of, called autophagy, which means self-eating. Auto means self, phagy is eating, so self-eating, autophagy. Parts of our cells become damaged, and that's the garbage. Our cells chew up that material and recycle it. That's how they take out the garbage. Erlang has a garbage collector, and that's exactly what it does. It basically tries to figure out, are there strings and other variables in there that I no longer need, and then it gets rid of them. Won't go into detail on that, but garbage collection is something that cells and Erlang processes both do. This is an example of how it happens inside the cell. The cell collects all the junk that it doesn't want. It puts them into something called an agrisome, and the agrisome gets eaten by something else and eventually cleaned out. This biologist won the Nobel Prize in medicine for figuring out this process of autophagy. Fasting activates autophagy, which helps slow down the aging process and has a positive impact on cell renewal. During starvation, cells break down proteins and other cell components and use them for energy. During autophagy, cells destroy viruses and bacteria and get rid of damaged structures. It's a process that's critical for cell health, renewal, and survival. I've been losing weight for about 5 years, and I've been fasting for about 1.5 years now. I don't do like super long fasts, but I try to not eat between 8 p.m. and noon the next day. And by giving my body a break, it gives it a chance to do some of this autophagy. If you're eating all the time, your body is sort of in the growth phase all the time. It's good to give your body time to repair itself. And you can trigger that repair by not eating. And so I do that. I encourage you to check it out. If you want to know more, I have a website that I created, hope to extend, called nutrition.zone. There's also an exercise.zone, and there'll hopefully someday be a lot more of them. But if you want to know anything about exercise or nutrition, you might want to check that out. There are definitely talks on there about fasting, intermittent fasting, if you're curious. This is a quote from Harvard University professor of evolutionary biology, Daniel Lieberman. Because we evolved to be physically active, we also evolved a diverse array of repair and maintenance mechanisms that respond to that physical activity. We basically overshoot with our responses. Imagine you spill some coffee on the kitchen floor and then you clean it up. You clean it up such that the floor is now cleaner than it was before you spilled the coffee. physical activity turns on all these repair and maintenance mechanisms. And because you don't want to undershoot, you overshoot. The result is a benefit. So by tearing your body down, you enable it to build itself back up stronger. These are some, there's many, many more. I can only fit these on this slide, but you can go to the link if you want to see all of them. But these are various hormones that are secreted by various parts of your body that are basically endocrine signals that travel through your bloodstream and trigger responses far, far away. And I liken this to PubSub. I think this is and this is something that Erlang does not have built into it, but I think is very interesting. The idea, so the hormones that float around your body are specific, there are receptors in specific parts of your body that respond to those chemical signals. So the selective receive, again, I think of it in programming terms like PubSub. So in PubSub, you have topics. You can have topic A, topic B. Messages for topic A go to the topic A. It's usually, when you actually implement it, it's more complex than this. But the idea is you store all the messages for one topic together, and you store all the messages for another topic together, and then anyone can subscribe to these topics. So these two, let's call them cells or processes, each subscribes to the topic A messages, and they'll each get a copy of all the topic A messages. These two, it could be one, it could be 100. Two is just arbitrary here, but each of these objects is subscribing to topic B and receiving a constant stream of all the messages that get sent to topic B. The same object could subscribe to topic A messages and topic B messages, but that's how a PubSub system works. You subscribe to a topic, and then you can publish to a topic, and the publishers and the consumers don't need to be interacting with each other. They can be far away. They don't have to know the other exists. There's sort of a place to put the messages, and you can put them there without knowing who's going to consume them, and you can consume them without knowing who put them there. And that's sort of how hormones work in your body. So I've just changed this diagram here. The pituitary gland spits out growth hormone, and the growth hormone is effectively subscribed to by fat cells, liver cells, and muscle cells. How does it subscribe? It subscribes by putting receptors on its cell membrane to catch that, to grab that specific type of ligand. I think it's called a ligand here, but the hormone, whatever that chemical is, it just puts a receptor there, and that's effectively subscribing to those messages. Similarly, your testicles, if you're a man, produce testosterone, and your muscle cells and hair follicles subscribe to the testosterone channel or topic. Interestingly, it turns out different hair follicles respond to testosterone differently at different times. So they're also state machines. There's not a generic result, like testosterone always causes hair follicles to grow. It's actually more subtle and stateful than that. The different hair follicles can respond differently to the same signal. Again, it's a state machine. But the main point is that most these reactive microservice architectures that have become popular for scaling software systems, that's basically what this is here. This is each of these cells is reacting to messages that it receives, and it's doing so. Each cell is effectively a microservice, and it's reacting to messages, hormones, or other signals from other cells. And that is much more scalable than these monoliths, which I used to work in Ruby, and we had in Rails, and we had some gigantic code bases that were extremely hard to reason about. And when you change them, there would be ripple effects, side effects going all throughout the code. You'd break things you had no clue could possibly have been broken by a certain code change. Reactive microsystems tend to be more predictable and debuggable. There's a framework called Legome, which is quite interesting. I heard about this years ago, and it seems to still be around. It's a way to build reactive microservices in Java or Scala. It builds on top of Akka. Akka, I mentioned in an earlier presentation, is a framework for Scala, which uses the actor model. It implements the actor model. So Legome is built on top of this actor model, and allows you to build reactive microservices. So this is something that maybe Erlang someday could do, or Elixir could do, and to some extent you could say that Phoenix PubSub, actually I think that's my next slide, Phoenix, the framework, the web framework for Elixir, does out of the box provide a PubSub mechanism. So although it's not built directly into Elixir or Erlang, you can easily add this to an Elixir or Erlang setup, and it comes out of the box with Phoenix, and it's very useful. This is an interesting talk. Elixir and Erlang don't have a monopoly on concurrency. This is the creator of Go. I don't know much about Go, but it's interesting. They do have Go. I think they're called Go routines, and they use a different mechanism. Instead of sending a message directly to another process by PID or by registered name, it seems to use these channels, and channels can be I'm not even going to try to describe them here, but it's a different mechanism for sending messages between processes, and you can check it out if you want. This talk was quite interesting. There's also a direct contact way for cells to communicate with each other. If they literally touch each other, in this particular example, you have a macrophage here and a helper T cell, and the macrophage has swallowed some sort of virus. It's chopped up the virus, it's taken a little piece of that virus and stuck it on its own membrane, and the helper T cell has come along and touched that and detected it's called an antigen, and it's basically saying, the macrophage is saying, here's a dangerous message you should look out for, and the helper T cell grabs the message and says, oh, okay, I will watch out for that message and kill anything that displays that message. And that's one of the ways that you form immunity to viruses, for example. So this is what's called direct cell-to-cell communication, or direct binding. There's other mechanisms for cells to talk directly with each other. In Erlang, we tend to use this specific approach where you basically have one cell interacting directly with another cell. But there are other mechanisms by which messages could be passed within Erlang. And some other languages use other mechanisms, but biology is an inspiration. It could give us more ideas. I got excited when I saw this book, Computational Cell Physiology. It says, the laws of diffusion, electricity, and mass action are explained and applied to elucidate the mechanisms by which cells establish a resting membrane potential, achieve osmotic balance, generate action potentials, initiate secretion, and control muscle contraction. It also has examples in Python, so it's right on the border between biology and computation. Looks very interesting. And I happen to know, don't tell anyone, but I happen to know Sienna's bringing me that book for Christmas, which I'm very excited about. He's also bringing me this book, which I'm also very excited about. So I'm hoping to dig more into biology, because I really think it holds a lot of potential for evolving software systems more scalably and reliably and fault tolerantly. Another area of interest to me is DNA replication. When your cell divides, it needs to replicate the DNA, as we saw in the short video earlier. And when that happens, mutations occur, because these are chemicals copying other chemicals. Or I guess proteins copying other proteins. Cells employ an arsenal of editing mechanisms to correct mistakes made during DNA replication. Every time a human cell divides and its DNA replicates, it has to copy and transmit the exact same sequence of 3 billion nucleotides to its daughter cells. Mistakes are fixed through various DNA repair processes. Repair enzymes recognize structural imperfections between improperly paired nucleotides, cutting out the wrong ones and putting the right ones in their place. These enzymes do make mistakes at a rate of about 1 per every 100,000 nucleotides, which sounds pretty good, but with our 6 billion base pairs in each diploid cell, that would amount to about 120,000 mistakes every time a cell divides. And of course, cells don't divide once. Your entire body evolved from a single cell. So those cells have divided over and over and over again. So the fact that we're not just a pile of DNA replication errors is amazing, and that's thanks to the error correction mechanisms within each of our cells. and how accurately they can detect and repair DNA breaks and tears and bends and all kinds of issues like that. The next button. Oh, sorry, wait, there was. Some of the mistakes are corrected immediately during replication through a process known as proofreading. So let's watch another video, short video clip on DNA repair, damage and repair.
Damage to DNA can include single-strand breaks, double-strand breaks, changes to the DNA code, DNA kinks, and DNA sticking together. It has been estimated that an individual cell can suffer up to 1 million DNA changes per day. A special sentinel protein called P53 is recruited rapidly in response to DNA damage. P53 slides along the DNA until it finds a critical site. It then binds to this site. P53 then sends the message to halt cell division until DNA is repaired, or if damage is too severe, the cell is destroyed. P53 is therefore known as the guardian of the genome.
Let's look at one more short video clip.
If only one strand of the DNA is damaged, this can be easily repaired. HARP proteins bind to the damage and attract other proteins that repair the damage. When damaged DNA duplicates before the damage is repaired, a double-strand break can arise. In a healthy cell, this more severe damage can be repaired with the help of homologous recombination. The RCA1 protein binds the loose ends of the DNA and starts to unravel the DNA strands. Using the undamaged DNA strand as a template, the damage is then repaired. Finally, the two strands are separated, leaving both DNA strands error-free. In patients with hereditary breast cancer, the BRCA1 mechanism does not work. When a double-strand break arises in the cells of these patients, the DNA cannot be repaired. The persisting damage can cause cells to die, but it can also transform a cell into a cancer cell.
I find that astonishing that our DNA can be repaired, that chemicals, which don't have brains, can detect breakages and fix them and coordinate other chemicals to come in and help with the repair. And the idea that the double helix allows you to, it gives you a backup copy of everything. It allows you to repair your own errors by, even if something gets deleted, you have a backup copy, and then there's a mechanical machine inside of each of your cells that can actually go and rebuild the broken DNA. It's astonishing to me. I encourage you to watch those whole clips and some more to get a sense of what's going on inside our cells every moment. It's astonishing. I want to look at this idea of error correction. At the end, the last section of today's video is going to be a long code example in which we make multiple copies of the data, each in a separate process, and we'll be able to, if any of those processes die, we'll be able to recover the state by grabbing it from one of the other processes. So I will be demoing that in a bit. I want to show another form of error correction now, which is available to you as an Erlang or Elixir developer. It's in this fabulous book, which I love this for several reasons. First of all, it's a whole book dedicated to the concept of property-based testing, and property-based testing is another quiver in your arsenal that allows you to test more comprehensively than you probably have ever tested before, if you can come up with a concept for a property that explains what the code is supposed to do. So normally when we code and we write tests for our code, we come up with examples. We say, okay, if x is 0, this should happen. If x is 3, this should happen. What property-based testing allows you to do is say, for all x greater than or equal to 0, this property should hold, or something. And it can be much more complex. It doesn't have to be a single variable. It could be, you could have whole data structures that you're generating dynamically. But you basically say, for all inputs in this class of inputs, which could be an infinitely large class of inputs, these are the properties that should hold for the outputs. It's a much more generic way of testing. It's at a higher level of abstraction. It allows you, at least in theory, to cover far, far more cases with far less testing code. So instead of having to think through explicitly every possible example and every edge case, you can, if you can come up with a property that that explains what the code is supposed to do or the function is supposed to do, you can encapsulate all the possible theoretical tests within that property-based test. And then every time you run your code, you can specify how many times you want the inputs to be generated and tested against the criteria that you've specified in your property. And every run of your test suite will generate a different set of inputs. And the idea is that the more that you run your test suite, the more of the possible input space will be explored. And as you explore more and more of the possible inputs, you will potentially hit on lots of bad inputs that you had never considered could break things that actually do break things. There's a lot more to property-based testing. I'm not going to go deeper into that. There's model-based testing, and there's various other things that I'll hope to get into in future videos. But I just want to present the basic concept and a very simple example test so that you can get a sense of what it is. Another thing I love about this book is that he intentionally puts all the examples in both Elixir and Erlang. So you can see it helps you, if you're an Erlang developer, it'll help you understand Elixir code and vice versa. It also, it's I think it's wonderful that it's helping bring the community together. The more we can consider ourselves as Beam developers rather than as just Elixir or just Erlang developers, I think that benefits everyone. And earlier I showed in this today's episode, I showed an example from this book. I'm also really enjoying this book, which I got a couple weeks ago, and I'm about I think I'm a third of the way through the book, maybe a little bit more. I've just gotten to the OTP sections. It's a great book. If you want to learn Erlang, or if you're an Elixir developer and you want to get into Erlang, this is probably the best place to start. I have a number of other Erlang books, and I've read good chunks of them, and they're also quite good, but this might be the best. It's labeled explicitly as a beginner's guide, and I think it is a very good beginner's guide. So Fred Hebert has tremendous lectures online that you can watch on YouTube. He's also written several great books, and I encourage you to check them out. Okay, so let's take a look at property-based testing. I've created a Erlang application called Divisible. I created it using rebar 3, which you can look up. It's all one word, rebar with the number 3 at the end. It's the standard way, I believe, to create Erlang applications. And then I installed Proper, which is, I think, a mashup of property and Erlang. So Proper is the library for doing property-based testing that Fred Hebert covers in his book. There's actually several others, and Elixir has a very popular one, but I'll cover that maybe in a future video. Right now, let's focus on Proper so we can get the basic concept down. So within the test directory, I used Proper to generate a property-based test file. The way Proper does it, all files end with, sorry, I have a prefix of prop underscore, so that's why this is called prop underscore divisibility. That signals to Proper that it is a property-based test file, so it needs to run those tests when I ask it to run all the tests. Open it up. Again, we're including the Proper library here, and the name of the module has to start with prop underscore. Then there's 3 sections, and this is basically as dead simple a test as I can come up with. So you have your properties section, you have helpers, which can be whatever you want to throw in there, and then you have generators. And so let's start up in the property section here. So what we're going to do, let's start. It's a little, the syntax is a little odd, but everything in the begin-end block is the actual test. IsNumber is built into Erlang. It's just a function. Num and denom are numerator and denominator. Num and denom are variables here, and those variables are getting passed into this begin-end block from this tuple. So this tuple is defining the specific generated inputs for a single run of this test. So these are specific values. They will change. Every test will have a different num and a different denum. Although theoretically, I mean, it could by chance happen to have the same value. But this tuple will be generated every single time and will be generally different for every run of the test. This tuple is defining where the values here come from. So numerator is a function that I have defined down below in the generator section, as is denominator. So these are two functions I defined. The way that you generate values and pass them into a property-based test for proper is to create a begin-end block here or something similar. Have a test in here that's going to return a Boolean value. So if the test succeeds, it should return true, and otherwise it should return false or blow up or something. I think false is what it's supposed to do. And then you're supposed to say this is true for every set of values that gets generated by this tuple here. So in this case, we're generating a combination of a single numerator and a single denominator, and we're assigning the numerator to num and the denominator to denum. Then we're running this, and if it returns true, the test passes, and if it returns false, it does not pass. This we're not actually using. I can comment this out. This was we could put whatever functions we want here. Like if isNumber did not exist in Erlang, we could create something to a function and use it here as part of our test. So the generators are what generate the specific values for each run of the test. So I've created one called numerator here, and it is just basically delegating to integer, which is actually, because we included the proper library, it included something called, I think it's proper integer. So there's something, the library itself has a built-in function called integer, which is callable just without prefixing it with the module name or anything. As one of is also built into proper. What one of does is allows you to define a list of possible things, and then it will choose one of them. So in this case, this is sort of how you might do an example-based test. Rather than try to come up with an exhaustive list, well, this is sort of in between. So this is, you could say, actually, let's do it this way. I think this might be clearer. So in an example-based test, you might say one of 1, 2, 3. See if this works. I don't even know if this will work, but it's going to basically say we're going to pick 3 specific values, and we would test each of them independently. And if all 3 of these values passed, then we would consider the whole test a success. Let's see if this works. I don't know if this will work or not. Here we go. So rebar 3 proper. Oh no, it did not. So function one of doesn't work that way. Sorry. Oh, because I didn't make it a list. It has to be a list. Let's see if this works. Sorry. This might work. Hey, it worked. Okay, and however many, so n, I'm passing in here a value of 3, so it's running the test 3 times and generating inputs 3 different times. We can do it 300 times if we want. It'll take a little longer, but it will work. We could even do 3,000 times. And so it just ran 3,000 tests, each test generating a different value for the specific inputs as the numerator and denominator. So obviously we did not find the failure case because we weren't clever enough to realize that 0 as a denominator value could break this. And that's one of the challenges of traditional testing, example-based testing, is if you don't happen to get the right inputs explicitly in your tests, you're not going to catch the bug. So here, similarly, so this is actually more of a property-based test. We're testing. We're saying, okay, it could be in the range of 1 to 10. It could be in the range of 11 to 100. It could be in the range of 1,000, 1 to 10,000, whatever it might be. So in this case, again, we're gonna just run the test. It's generating, in this case, a whole bunch of random values. But again, we missed out on the value that's actually going to break this thing, which I suspect you can guess is going to be 0. we could explicitly put 0 in there, but let's pretend we're not clever enough to figure that out. So in that case, if we just, this will sometimes catch it because I've added integer here. So it will just pick a random integer. If it hits on this case, it's going to pick a random integer. And if it happens on 0, the thing will blow up and our test will fail. So let's see if we can catch it now. So there we go. So it did fail. Another thing it does is called shrinking. So shrinking is, so in this case, it happened to try the two values 0 and 0, so a numerator of 0 and a denominator of 0. It tries to, pick some edge cases that make sense, as well as just picking random integers, because there's obviously an infinite number of integers. So it tries to be smart about it. And you can change the probabilities that certain values get picked. There are ways to do that within proper. But in this case, it could have picked, for example, 7 and 0, and it might have shrunk it down to 0 and 0. It tries to find the simplest. In this case, it was already really, really simple. But sometimes you get a much more complex thing that breaks it, and then proper will go and try to shrink it down to the simplest possible case. But in this case, it's telling us that the value 0, 0 failed here. And then we can say, oh boy, we missed that in our code, and oh yeah, we're going to have to rule out the value of 0 or whatever it might be. So that's how property-based testing works at the most basic level. It gets much more complicated, and I'm not yet very familiar with all the details. So as I learn more, hopefully I'll present more on this topic. But error correction, this is a way to test things that you might and find more subtle bugs when you have more complex interacting code. This enables you, in theory, to find some very tricky edge cases that you would have never considered. And in the opening chapters of Fred's book, he shows some examples of how property-based testing has found some incredibly subtle bugs in some very serious code, and it often can do so with very little test code. It can run through massive amounts of scenarios and find specific scenarios that break code in ways that no human being would ever imagine could arise. So it's very interesting. Another interesting thought I recently had is that evolution itself is a form of exploring the potential solution space and identifying better solutions while weeding out inferior solutions that get competed to extinction. Of course, everyone knows this, but it is sort of how property-based testing works as well. You explore and genetic algorithms. Again, it's just another example of how biology and programming can inform each other. It's not moving forward. There we go. So I mentioned earlier endocytosis, which is the ability of a cell to swallow something from its surrounding environment. That can be how it gets nutrients, for example. Smuggling stuff into cells is actually very, very tricky. And the mRNA vaccines that many of us have recently received are a biomedical miracle. And one of the biggest challenges they had to overcome was this step of getting this is messenger RNA here. The messenger RNA, what messenger RNA is it's basically a recipe for building proteins. And the messenger RNA typically, by nature, it gets created from DNA. So DNA gets turned into messenger RNA. DNA lives in your cell nucleus, doesn't travel through the cytoplasm, the rest of the cell. The messenger RNA gets created from the DNA and then floats through the cytoplasm, where it can produce proteins based on the recipe that it copied from the DNA itself. We humans have decided that, or figured out how to leverage the mechanisms within the cytoplasm that are able to take messenger RNA and use it as a recipe to generate proteins. We've been able to figure out how to slip our own messenger RNA into our own cells and then have our own cells machinery for translating messenger RNA into synthesizing proteins for our own benefit. And the mRNA vaccines from Moderna and Pfizer do exactly this. But getting the messenger RNA into our cells is very tricky because if it were just floating around loose in your bloodstream, it would get destroyed right away. And if you tried to get it into the cell itself, it wouldn't be able to get in there. And if it did get in there, if it didn't get in the proper way, it would probably also get destroyed before it actually got used to generate proteins within your cells. So decades of innovation and thinking and research has gone into this process where they build up a fancy protective layer around the messenger RNA that allows it to get into the cell and then to get to the right place so that it's actually used. By the way, the thing that it generates, the messenger RNA is an instruction for proteins, and what the proteins do is they basically create little spikes on the outside of your cell that then your immune system can use to train itself to attack the actual virus. So the spike proteins that you're putting on the outside of your cell to train your immune system, they're just the spike proteins. So if you think of the SARS-CoV-2, the virus, there's like the main body of the virus, and there's all the spikes that stick out from it. And so we're not replicating anything about the body, just the spikes. And that's enough to train your immune system to protect you. But okay, so this is the little picture I showed of the messenger RNA inside a little thin red film here. It's actually more complicated and more amazing still. So these are lipid nanoparticles that are, I don't know how they create them. It's astonishing to me. But in this picture here, these little things in the centers of these little circles are the actual messenger RNA. And then there's various other layers of different kinds of lipids and a cholesterol that are wrapped around, and there's little things on the outside. I think the things on the outside are to get these little tiny nanoparticles to the right parts of your body to get them to attach to the immune cells, and I forget what the other type of cells that they want to connect to, muscle cells maybe. But basically we need to infiltrate these messenger RNAs into the right place in the right cells, and this is a complex bioengineering miracle that allows that to happen, which is just astonishing. But what they're doing is this is the inside. The messenger RNA is a program, and what we're doing is we're sticking a program into your cells that will cause the cell to generate, to do things. So this is computing. We're basically reprogramming our cells on the fly, and this is the actual sequence, or at least part of the sequence, for building the spike proteins. So we're slipping the instructions into each of your cells to say, okay, generate this thing, and then that thing will create spikes, which cause your immune system to figure out how to protect yourself against the real virus if you get infected later, which is just mind-blowing. It's also hot code reloading, which is something we haven't yet. I think we've mentioned it, but we haven't actually seen it yet. But Erlang enables you to do hot code reloading, which is the ability to modify your processes on the fly without like tearing them down and rebuilding them. And the mRNA vaccines are doing this and protecting us from COVID in the process. It's amazing. And there's tremendous other potential uses for this messenger RNA approach now that they've enabled it for protecting against COVID. It can be used potentially to protect against, to help attack cancer cells and prevent cancer, to reprogram your cells in all kinds of different ways. I mean, they're literally using the word programming here. They are able to program the behaviors of your cells by putting this messenger RNA into your cells. And potentially we could even edit the DNA itself, so to reprogram your cells and maybe future, offspring as well. So the possibilities are amazing. We're basically doing programming in biology now. This is a quote from an article about dreaming. This is another form, I'm going to argue, of hot code reloading. So they're learning more about dreams and dreaming, and it says dreaming may be a reflection of the brain processes supporting sleep-dependent memory processing. Sleep-dependent memory processing is not necessarily associated with offline reiteration of recent experiences in their original form. Instead, memories may be enhanced in part through a more nuanced process that slowly integrates the critical elements of recent experience into established and remote semantic memory networks, facilitating the gradual evolution of more flexible and ultimately more useful memory representations. So what this is saying in kind of complex words is that when you have experiences in your life and then you sleep, your brain consolidates. It doesn't just copy those memories verbatim into your brain. What it does is more nuanced, and it basically takes all the things that you currently think you know, and it takes all the new experiences that you've had, and it mushes them together in a way that hopefully improves what you know. So it may detect errors in your thought processes or your belief systems. It will maybe even transform some of those memories in various ways. It may realize, oh, I couldn't have seen Joe. It must have been Phil that I saw. I don't know what it is. I'm just making stuff up. But the point is that the memory consolidation is an active process in which your brain transforms its own thinking. It's not just recording a memory. It's taking that information and merging it with all the information it already has to come up with a better understanding of the world and a better way of perceiving and understanding that world. So it is you're basically rewriting your brain every time you dream, which is also another form of hot code reloading, I would argue. We don't have to kill ourselves and then spawn a new version of ourselves. Every time we dream at night, we're synthesizing a new version of ourselves based on the additional experiences we've had the prior day. This is probably my favorite part of today's presentation. So I'm going to talk about bilateral symmetry in the brain. Well, actually, it's not just in the brain. I mean, we have two arms, we have two ears, we have two eyes. There's a reason for this. Bilateral symmetry dominates the animal world. More than 99% of species are bilaterally symmetric. So there must be a really, really important reason why this is so, or multiple reasons potentially. I like this quote. Since animals with bilateral symmetry have been evolving for 500 million years, it's safe to assume there's a good reason. Evolutionary anthropologists guess that we have two limbs, two lungs, two kidneys, because the dual organs gave our ancestral organisms some kind of advantage, not because they're spare parts. I would argue that spare parts is an advantage. If you lose, a kidney, it's nice to have another kidney. It can keep you going. If you lose an arm, it's good to have another arm because you can still potentially keep going. My grandmother lost a lung to disease, I think it was tuberculosis, many decades ago, and was able to continue on for many decades with her other lung. So I think having a spare part is a big advantage, but there's a belief that there's some other advantage as well. And that seems so bilateral symmetry can confer disadvantage as well as advantage. Asymmetry can increase efficiency of processing by reducing duplication of brain circuitry and interference between different functions. Asymmetry also creates better use of brain space by providing for increased specialization. In sheer computational terms, symmetry is unnecessarily restrictive. It would be foolhardy at best to try to design a computer while retaining bilateral symmetry among its elements. So I went to the scientific literature and I tried to understand, why we have two hemispheres. And I may just not have read the literature enough. But the first few things I stumbled on seem to suggest that we really have no idea why bilateral symmetry in the brain exists, but it's probably not about duplication or redundancy or any of that stuff, because that would just be really stupid. No one would build a computer to have bilateral symmetry among its elements for like failover or anything. But I'm going to argue that's exactly what exactly what Joe Armstrong argued for. He said if you want to have resilience, you need to have that ability to fail over. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence that although our brains are not completely bilateral and duplicates of each other, there's a lot of duplication and potential for duplication. And so I think having two hemispheres is potentially part of a failover mechanism as well. If you have a damage to one part of your brain, there's a lot of tremendous evidence that other parts of your brain can compensate and cover for the deficiency that you've had by getting bashed in your head in a certain place, for example. In spite of the pressures toward asymmetry, the brain seems to retain a moderately high degree of symmetry, at least early in development, which can allow one hemisphere to take over the acquisition of functions if the normally dominant one is damaged. The uneasy balance between symmetry and asymmetry in the human brain is betrayed by individual variation. Reversals of handedness, so that's like being right-handed or left-handed, and cerebral asymmetry are relatively common. About 25% of the population lack the biological disposition to be right-handed. So basically, they're struggling to understand why we have two hemispheres, and I think the answer is in part because it allows you to, it's fault tolerance and failure recovery. This is a CAT scan, MRI scan of somebody who had to have half their brain removed because they had seizures. And the quotes are, it is amazing. I've seen people on camera, on video, who have half a brain, and I wouldn't have known that unless somebody told me that. And this is somebody who is an expert at, has met many such people. People with hemispherectomies that we studied were remarkably high functioning. When I sit in front of the computer and see these MRI images showing only half a brain, I still marvel that the images are coming from the same human being I just saw walking and talking, and who has chosen to devote his or her time to research. So these people, some of these people with just one hemisphere have volunteered for scientific purposes to be part of these studies. But it is amazing how functional one can be with just one hemisphere and completely lacking the other hemisphere of one's brain. And so this gets us to the Erlang. I think this is from Joe's history of, I'll try to put it in the notes. The largest ever system built in Erlang was the AXD301. It had 2.6 million lines of Erlang code. It was also highly reliable and runs in real time. It runs on a cluster using pairs of processors and is scaled up to 16 pairs of processors. Each pair is self-contained, which means that if one processor in the pair fails, the other takes over. Individual nodes can be taken out of service for repair, and additional nodes can be added without interrupting services. So you have two copies of everything. You have two processors doing every job, which the earlier article, the biologists were trying to explain away the possibility that the brain could be built redundantly, because they're just saying that's computationally inefficient. But there's a huge benefit, which is, for example, you could take one of the nodes out of service and continue operating and then put it back into service once you fix it up. So the failure recovery, the fault tolerance benefits are tremendous. And this is not just theoretical. It actually happens in real life. Dolphins sleep half a brain at a time. So they have one half of their brain sleeping while the other half is still allowing them to, swim around in the oceans and stay safe. It's a real advantage to them. And I don't know to what extent other animals benefit from various having the two hemispheres, but conceptually, both Joe Armstrong landed on this, and the Erlang trying to solve the telecom problems of reliability, and some animals also have evolved the ability to use just half their brain. So you could very much argue that it is a redundancy and fault tolerance and ability to do hot code reloading, etc. All these things are biological as well as things that Ericsson's hit on when they were trying to solve similar problems in the telecom space. So I'm going to go into my last example. This is a big example. I actually evolved this example over time, and you can, if you want to go into the details of how I evolved it, you can look inside the directory. There's a safe1.erl, a safe2.erl, I think goes all the way up to safe9.erl or safe10.erl. The very last version of it I have labeled just safe.erl, and that's the example I'll show you. But you can go look at the history of this if you want to see how it evolved and understand it better. You can. This is not exemplary code. This is just what I came up with when I was trying to play with Erlang to show how two or more brain cells could back each other up, and it shows that it's possible in Erlang, and it shows you one way to do it. but I am not an experienced Erlang developer, and this is not clean code. And if I were to build something similar, I would be using OTP rather than the Erlang primitives that I used. So you don't want to use this in production, and it may not even be a very good code example, but it works. And actually, what I did in this situation is I think what happened in the early days of Ericsson, as the history of Erlang explains. In the early days, the first couple of years of Erlang, all the developers at Ericsson were writing their code to do their things, and they were reinventing the wheel all the time. So they eventually created OTP to build generic servers, gen servers, and other constructs that were frequently used. So a gen server is the ability to have a client-server relationship, and the server loops through the state as we've shown in prior episodes, but done in a generic way, so that all the generic code that covers all the edge cases in terms of concurrency are in a library that you can just leverage rather than have to write for yourself. And then you just provide the business logic, the specific stuff about your particular use case that is not generic to the client-server paradigm. So that's what OTP is. We'll cover that in future videos. We briefly touched on it earlier in this episode with gen statem, but I did not use OTP in this particular example. This is just showing what is possible, but you may still want to look at the code and learn something from it. So with that caveat, let's look at the code. Okay, so because this is gonna scroll too quickly to see, I'm gonna initially walk through what the code looks like, or the code running looks like, then we'll actually run it, and then we'll look at the code a little bit. So if we started up our Erlang shell and we compiled the safe module and then we started it, this is what we would see in the output, documenting what's happening. So first, there's a process which has a registered name of safe, and it is telling us that it has started up on this PID, and it is running its start counter loop. It's then looking to see if backup 1 exists, and inside, so safe is running create backup 1 unless exists. It's not finding it. It's saying that backup one does not exist. So given that so the thing that safe is doing is safe is a process, and it has state. The state is simply an integer. It's a counter that we want to start at 0, and it's just going to increment every tick, which I think every second. But when safe first starts up, it doesn't start the counter at 0. It looks for backup 1 because safe could have crashed. And if safe crashed and it restarts, it wants to pull the current value from its backup, which is backup 1. And it's labeled backup 1 because we're going to also have backup 2, backup 3. We can have as many backups as we want. I'll show that in the second iteration of this. But right now we just have safe and we have backup 1. And so when safe starts up, it doesn't assume that it's starting up for the first time ever. It's thinking it may have crashed. So it attempts to contact backup 1, and if it finds backup 1, it gets its state from backup 1. Backup 1 holds a backup of the state, so it hands the integer back to safe, and that's what it starts counting from. In this case, since we're starting the program fresh, there is no safe and there is no backup 1. So when safe starts up, it does not find backup 1. So then it creates backup 1. And since there was no safe and there was no backup 1, it starts with the default initial value, which is 0. So it hands the value 0 to backup 1. Backup 1 starts up on a different PID, obviously, and it takes the value it received from safe and stores that as the value. Backup 1 then detects that it is the last backup. So again, I said there could be backup 2, backup 3, there could be however many backups we want. If you are, so in this case, there's a constant, a module constant, which is I set to 1, but we can change that in a minute. We'll make it 2, but for the moment there's only 1 backup, and so because of that, backup 1 after it's created knows that it is the last backup, and the last backup has a special Each backup is responsible for starting and monitoring the next backup. So backup 1, if there were 2 backups, would be responsible for backing up, for starting and monitoring backup 2. But when you get to the end of the line and you don't want to create any more backups, that last backup, which in this case is backup 1, is then going to monitor safe. So every process is monitored by some other process. So in this case, since there's just safe and there's backup 1 realizes it's the last backup, and it calls monitor safe. It then starts monitoring safe. Safe receives the current state update of 0 from backup 1. So backup 1, after it starts up, it hands the state to safe and says, this is the value you should be using. And we'll see in a minute if safe had restarted, if it had crashed and come back to life again, it would now receive a different value from backup 1. We'll see that in a minute. And then things just start ticking. So count and safe is now 1, backup 1 received new state of 1, count and safe is now 2, backup 1 receives new state of 2. And I hit the wrong button. Let's try this one. There we go. Count and safe is now 3. Backup 1 is now received new state of 3. So this is how it works. Safe now is doing the ticking and the incrementing. And every time it does so, it hands the updated value to backup 1 to store in case it ever crashes. We're going to crash backup 1, and then in a bit we're going to crash safe. But first let's kill backup 1. So where is backup 1 will give us the PID. Exit PID kill kills the process. 90 again is safe. So we just killed backup 1, which was 92. 90 is safe. So safe received a down message for backup 1, 92. So safe received a message that backup 1 just crashed. And when it receives that message, it then tries to recreate backup 1, or to start a backup 1 if it doesn't exist. So it checks again that it doesn't exist, finds it doesn't exist, so now it's creating a backup, and it's handing the backup the current state, which is 3. So backup 1 is starting, it goes into its backup loop with count 3. The next thing, since backup 1, again, the new backup 1 realizes I'm the last backup because there's only one backup. So I'm also responsible for monitoring the safe process. So it calls monitor safe process. Now it's monitoring safe process again. And then safe increments to 4, hands the new state of 4 to backup 1, increments to 5, hands the new state of 5 to backup 1, 6, 7, and then I manually kill the safe process. In this case, backup 1 receives a down message for the safe process, and then it restarts safe. When safe starts up, it gets a new PID. Well, it's a new process, so it gets a new PID. It's just the same registered name. And it starts running start counter loop. Instead of just starting at 0, it's going to look to see if there's a backup 1, and if so, it's going to try to get its value from backup 1. So running create backup 1 unless exists. It finds that there is a backup 1 running on 94. It then checks whether so it then does not create a backup because backup 1 already exists. Then safe receives a current state update of 7. So safe didn't know what the current state was because we crashed it, and it then tried to see is there a backup 1 or do I need to start a backup 1? And it found that there is a backup 1. So then it received a current state update from backup 1, and the value is 7. So then the next increment, it increments to 8, and then it passes the new state of 8 on to backup 1, etc. So we can crash either of these processes and it will recover because it's monitoring the other process, and when it goes down, the process will do the right thing, and both processes own the state. So whichever process crashes, the other one always has the most recent state and can pass it back to the recreated crashed process. So this could be 2 brains, it could be Erlang processes running on 2 different servers, so that if one computer crashed, the other one could recover, etc. But the basic principle is you have 2 processes that monitor each other. They each hold a copy of the state, and if either of them crashes, the one that did not crash is responsible for recreating the crashed process and handing it the state that it should have. So here I just changed one line in the program to say I want to have 2 backups this time, and we're running the same exact thing. So in this case, again, safe starts up, nothing is running, so it checks to see if backup 1 exists. It doesn't, so it creates backup 1, and since it presumes by the fact that safe and backup 1 both didn't exist that we're starting over, so we start with a value of 0. Backup 1 starts, but when backup 1 starts, it checks to see whether there's a backup 2, and backup 2 does not yet exist. So backup 1 creates backup 2 and hands it the initial starting value of 0. Backup 2 then starts and goes into its backup loop, and it has a state of 0. Safe now receives the value of 0 as the current state from backup 1. The last backup, in this case, in the last example, backup 1 was the last backup. In this case, since we're running 2 backups, backup 2 is the last backup. And backup 2 realizes that since it's the last backup, it's responsible for monitoring safe. It does that. And then we start incrementing. So safe increments its value to 1. It hands that new state, updated state, to backup 1. Backup 1 then passes along the updated state to backup 2, and everybody is now in sync again. The next tick, the same thing happens. Next tick, same thing happens. Now everything has a state of 3, and now I manually kill safe. When I manually kill safe, in this case the backup 2 was monitoring safe, so it receives a down message for safe. It restarts safe. Safe starts running its counter loop. It then checks whether backup 1 exists. Backup 1 did not crash, so it does exist. So it doesn't recreate a backup 1. It receives an update of the status, 3, which is what it used to be, from backup 1. So then safe is back in business again. Backup 1 and backup 2 had the value of 3, and now safe does as well. So all 3 are in sync again. The next time safe ticks, it increments to 4, and then it passes that value on to backup 1, which passes it on to backup 2. So this is how the program works. Now we'll run the program and see it in action. But first, I just want to point out that it's in the failure recovery directory. There's a whole bunch of safe1 through safeN files in there, as well as safe.erl without a number. Safe.erl is the one we'll look at. That's my final version. Safe1 was my very first version. Safe2 was the next version. So if you want to see how the program evolved over time, again, it's not exemplary code, but you should be able to, if you're curious, see the evolution of the program over time. So let's first run it. We're going to open our Erlang shell and compile safe. And we say safe start. And you see it, everything started up. We have 2 versions of the backup. There's backup 1 and backup 2, as well as safe. And the state is staying in sync. Let's try killing backup 1, seeing what happens. The state, it jumped from 11 to 12, so everything stayed in sync, and it did not lose the state. Let's try killing safe itself. The state jumped from 20 to 21, and everything's in sync again. So let's try killing backup 2. Oh, I hit a crash loop. I'm not sure why, but that did not work out well. Interesting. Yeah, this is not perfect code, and this is why you want to ensure that you're using OTP. OTP tends to cover edge cases. There can be tricky little nasty bugs that are very hard to debug when you do everything from scratch. And OTP is a library that's designed to keep all the generic parts that have tricky bits like this in terms of concurrency from blowing up. And you just focus on providing the business logic. Let's see if I can do this again. So kill backup 2. Okay, we're still running. Kill backup 1. We're still running. Everything's in sync. And kill safe. Everything's running and stayed in sync. So we didn't lose the state this time around. Occasionally that happens with this program. There's something crashes and it ends up in a crash loop, but I'm not sure what's going on. But again, that's why you want to use OTP. It's a good example of why using OTP is valuable. It will prevent issues like this. There's some really tricky scenarios that you might bump into. So let's take a look at the actual code here. Again, safe.erl. Go to the top of the file. So you'll see num backups too. We can change that to whatever we want. If we say 5, then it will create backup 1 through backup 5, and backup 5 would be responsible for monitoring safe. Again, it's like a loop. Everything starts up and monitors the next thing in the chain, although the chain is a loop in this case, so the last backup monitors safe. Safe monitors backup 1 monitors backup 2. In theory, this would allow us to recover from multiple failures. So let's say you had 10 backups. You would have 11 copies of the state at any given moment. So if 4 of those processes all crashed, you would still have 7 processes that would hold on to the state. And most or all of them would agree, and you would then have some sort of consensus algorithm. If they didn't agree, you could use a consensus algorithm to figure out what the correct value to sync to would be. I did not take it seriously enough to build all that logic in, but in theory you could do that if you wanted to have take advantage of the fact that you have more than one backup copy. You could survive, in theory, multiple failures. Joe Armstrong talks about this a lot in terms of Erlang, that you can get any level of protection against server crashes you want as long as you have independent things. So if you put the same information on 100 different machines and they're staying in sync, then if 99 of them crash, you still have one that has the information in it. So as long as they're truly independent and they don't all crash in like a chain reaction, you should be safe. So in this case, as an example, we just do 2 backups, but we can make that whatever we want. The starts up the whatever the module is and registers under the name of the module, so it's safe. This is starting up the safe process, and it's spawn monitor, so the shell is monitoring it but not linking. So when the safe process starts up, it runs start counter loop. Here's start counter loop. Start counter loop is going to output that it's starting up. It's going to look for the backup 1, and if it doesn't find it, it's going to create it. It's then going to be asking backup 1 for its state. So it's expecting backup 1 to tell it what its initial state is. So if backup 1 is running when safe starts up, safe will be polling. It'll be sending messages to backup 1 saying what's the current state. I'm making a state request to backup 1. So it's sending a message like this, state request with its own PID, sending it to backup 1, and then if it doesn't get an answer, it's going to try again, and it's going to try every second for up to 5 times, I believe, is what this is doing. So it's going to say, hey, backup 1, what's the current value of the state? Hey, backup 1, what's the current value of the state? And eventually it'll get a response. When it does, it will hit this receive. The message will land in its inbox with the current state. So backup 1 will have sent a message to safe with current state, the atom, and then an integer as count. And then safe will enter its counter loop. If, on the other hand, later down the road, backup 1 dies, the safe process will get a message, a down message about process 1, backup 1, and it will then put a message there, and it will restart the counter loop. When it'll basically loop here again, and that will discover that backup 1 no longer exists, and it will then start it, and that's how this works. There's a lot of code here. I worked through this in a series of iterations that built this up slowly. This is the piece of the logic here where the backup is trying to determine, so if its backup number is less than the number of backups. So let's say we're doing 10 backups, and this backup knows it's backup number 7. So 7 is less than 10, so I'm not the last backup. So my responsibility is starting and monitoring the next backup number. So if I'm backup number 7, I'm responsible for backup 8. So I'll start backup 8 unless it already exists. Maybe I'm the only one that crashed, in which case I won't be starting up backup num 8 because it already exists. If, however, my backup number, if we have 10 backups and I'm backup 10, in that case, I'm the very last one. So instead of starting another backup, I should just monitor safe. And so that's what I do here. There's a lot of, oh, and this is restarting. So if you receive a down message, you process it again. If I'm the very last backup, then the thing that crashed is the safe process. So I need to backup. So I need to restart safe. This is going to restart safe. I could call it restart safe. That would be clearer. Whereas if my backup number is not the same as the number of backups, then I'm not the last backup in the chain, and what crashed is my backup, the thing I'm backing up. So yeah, so my backup. If I'm backup 7, then backup 8 must have crashed because that's what I'm monitoring. So therefore, I need to create backup 8 again. It's crashed, so it won't exist, but we check just to be safe, and then we restart it. Monitoring safe. Yeah, so create backup unless exists. Create or update backup. Num backups. This is an ugly way. There's probably a much easier way to do this, but so this is called a module attribute. I think I called it a module constant earlier. It's a module attribute, which has in our case a constant value. We're saying that num backups is the value 2. This is a very, very complicated way to get the value 2 back, and there is a much easier way in Elixir. There probably is in Erlang as well, and I don't know why that's so. That should probably not have to be nearly that complicated, but it works. Backup Atom. This is a list to Atom. So this is take it list. A character list in Erlang is a name. So like backup 1 is a list of characters, and if you want to turn that into an atom, you call list to atom on the list of characters. Send with retries, again, this is the logic where I'm sending, or the safe process is sending a message to backup 1 trying to get the current state because it has crashed and restarted, and so it sends a message, and it if it doesn't get, it will retry. If it fails, it will retry a certain number of times. Retries left starts at I think 5, so it will retry up to 5 times, and then so this is again pattern matching. So the way pattern matching works, there's 2 clauses here with send with retries with 5 arguments. There's 2 versions of this, and they're separated with a semicolon here. We could have 10 versions of them, each of which would be separated with a semicolon. What Erlang does, and Elixir works the same way, it attempts to, when a function gets called, so if somebody calls send with retries with 5 arguments, it will attempt to match against the very first one, which is this one. If the third element is not 0, this will not match, and then it will then go down here. And since all 5 of these parameters are variables with no pattern matching, any call to send with retries that has 5 parameters will always match this. But if you have no more retries left, you will match here, and that's the end of the chain. So I won't go through every line of this in detail. You can look at this if you want to, but you saw the program in action, and it should give you a sense of how this can be used to create backups, or backups of backups, or backups of backups of backups. The details of that and getting it exactly right and completely error-free is tricky, but it is absolutely possible. I'm just not a sophisticated enough Erlang developer and did not devote enough time to this, but it is totally possible to do. Let's go back to our slides. So we just covered that. Another point I wanted to make is that the existence of extra copies of the data, I pointed this out earlier, could be leveraged to build a consensus algorithm or similar mechanism for intelligently handling multi-failure scenarios. So I showed recovering from a single failure at a time, but in theory you could recover from multiple failures at a time if you have enough backup copies. And as I said before I started showing the code examples, this is from the history of Erlang that Joe put together. The OTP behaviors themselves were designed to be used by large groups of programmers. So initially they didn't have OTP, they just had Erlang. And people wrote their own programs from scratch, and there were problems, or people would write the same functionality 10 different ways. And so Joe says the idea was that there should be one way to program a client server, and that all programmers who needed to implement a client server would write plugin code that slotted into a generic client server framework. The generic server framework provided code for all the tricky parts of a client server, taking care of things like code change, name registration, debugging, etc. When you write a client server using the OTP behaviors, you need only write simple sequential functions. All the concurrency is hidden inside the behavior. So in Elixir and Erlang, we leverage these OTP behaviors all the time. Usually you don't drop down to raw Erlang to do this because a lot of the tricky bits have been taken care of for you. One last point I want to make before I go to my summary slide is that since I started recording this episode, I discovered that C++ actually has its own actor framework, which seems to be pretty popular. It's got 2.6 thousand stars on GitHub. It's called the C++ actor framework. And then you've seen this slide before. This is my closing slide. I gave it near the beginning of the talk. Hopefully your interest is piqued in this topic. Again, this is what I think this whole presentation has been about. It was never clear to me when I first began this, but I think I slowly came to the conclusion that biology and software systems, as designed by Joe Armstrong et al. At Ericsson, basically we're trying to solve the same complexity problem, and they landed on very similar solutions. And so there's a lot that biology potentially can teach software developers, software engineers, and similarly there may be things that software could help biologists with, but I think biologists are leveraging software to a great deal, but biology has not been used by software developers to improve our software systems. And I think Erlang is a very special case where the structure of the language and what it enables is very similar to biology. So we may be able to extend Erlang further by taking more note of what biology has evolved over billions of years, because the problem space is very, very similar. Dealing with complex code is very much like complex bodies and organisms. And the way that both seem to work is that they have state machines, and large numbers of state machines that selectively receive messages. They send messages to one another and selectively receive them. As their states evolve, the messages that they respond to change, and their responses change over time. And I consider this an example of convergent evolution, because software and biology seem to have found a very similar set of solutions to the very similar set of problems that they both face. Thank you so much. If you've made it to the end, I'm amazed. It's been a journey for me. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Thank you for taking time to listen in to the third episode of ElixirZone. Take care.